remember Gene Sager wrote the Lightning Cube. Because he's my age, he graduated high school in Xavier. I didn't hear him about the so he talks about his 9/11 prophecies from Texas as a sick kid with the.
We just have a word
Yep.
about
It was wonderful book. Highly recommend it.
I would like to give you some information about Parliament if you're going to be leaving before tomorrow.
I'm Bob Flannery. I'm a trustee in the Parliament of the World's Religions. And how many are going to be leaving or not here tomorrow? Leaving. Want to make sure that people all get this. Okay, so I will come and see you right afterwards so you have the information. Real important, on the 15th of May, the prices for registration go up $100. So you need to think about that. How many here have been to the Parliament? Raise your hands. Quite a few, and I think quite a few others are planning to go who haven't been there. So please join us. It's, we expect 10,000 people down in Chicago and the country probably for another 10 years or more. So this is your opportunity. Thank you.
And we also have a missing pair of reading glasses. A missing pair of reading glasses. If you stumble upon them, but hopefully don't step on them, you can turn them into me or the owner. Thank you. And we do have a few more spots on the bus for the temple tonight. If you want to go add your name on the Uber app, or frankly just show up on this. David sent out instructions that the bus is going to be departing on the 6th Street side, and you can get there. Just go to the lobby level, and it's very clear how to get there. And I'll be in the lobby and can give you some directions if you have any questions. So I'll turn it over to our moderator.
Friends, my name is Chris Androsky, Chair of UMA USA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our final seminar of the day, The Future of Ecumenism, Part 2. For the next hour, we are invited into a conversation between friends from varying traditions within the Christian church. I'm going to start them off with some questions, but I would encourage you to be thinking of questions that you have for the panelists as well, and we will take those further along in our hour of time together. So as we get started, I'm going to invite you to each introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about yourself and your role in the tradition from which you come.
Great, thank you very much, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. I've got late in the day with you all, and so we're going to try to keep the energy level up. Because late in the day it can be a bit tough. I'm Alexei Lashkin, president of the Evangelical and Pentecostal Ecumenism and Dialogue Association. My role is to help convene conversations from denominational bodies with various Christian communities. So we have an active one going with Glen Marion Missioners, and prayerfully exploring one with mainline communities as well.
Hello, I'm Nathan Smith. I'm the Director of Ecumenism for Glen Marion Missioners. It's a Catholic religious society. I also work as the field rep for the U.S. Conference of Bishops and Catholic Bishops. And my work primarily focuses on relationships with evangelicals and Pentecostals to enhance understanding, reduce alienation, and foster reconciliation. So what that looks like is I work with seminary leaders, denominational leaders, multi-denominational leaders, to connect them with either the USCCB or the different efforts that we're doing within Glen Marion.
Hi, good afternoon. Christ is risen. Christos Anesti. Thank you. So, Father Nicholas Kazarian, first of all, I want to convey greetings and from His Eminence Archbishop Epiphanius, who is still in Egypt now for pilgrimage, the 4th pilgrimage in 1 year for him. So keep him in your prayers. He was delighted to know that I would attend the meeting. We met. He came last year in Orange County. It was a beautiful experience for him and all of us Orthodox participants. Thank you for inviting us again to be part of the conversation. So I'm Father Nicholas Kazarian. I am the director of, I take a big breath, the Department for Inter-Orthodox Ecumenical Interfaith Relations for the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. And you should see my business cards is more like a flyer than anything else. But anyway, glad to be here. As the title, the title of the job says, I'm in charge of ecumenical relations for the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. I'm also the co-secretary now for the Orthodox Catholics Theological Consultation that is meeting next week in Toronto. We're finishing up a beautiful document on marriage and pastoral dimension of mixed families, Orthodox Catholics, and I'm delighted to be with you today.
So your next question is, based on your work, what is important to your faith tradition or your faith family right now, and what impact do you think it could have in the future?
On the evangelical side, I would say that there are three trends that I would describe. One, since the 1990s, we have the trend of, and this is the more unfortunate trend, being more political and in positions of power and influence, and that is a priority for some within the movement. On the more Christian unity side, a second priority has been discussions between more conservative groups around mission and missional focus, so that's something you would not have seen 10 years ago. And a third priority, the part that I get to work on a bit more, is the engagement and furthering of engagement with Catholic communities. I'd say on the Pentecostal side, the priority has been to try to achieve some racial moments of healing, is how I describe it within their framework, which is a big part of Pentecostal origins. It's been a priority of theirs since the early 90s, but I'd say it's been deepening in the last 5 to 10 years. And a second priority is to actually engage in community dialogues with other Christian bodies and to try to get a little bit under the wing of their evangelical older brother, meaning to have their own independent relations with groups.
I feel intimidated by the question a little bit because it's like, oh man, there's so many other people in this room that can answer that question a lot better than I could. And are we talking about my own experience in this, or the experience of a Catholic in Africa, or what are we talking about? So I thought a lot about that. The synodal process seems quite important, obviously, for its ecumenical overtones. And in the States here, we have the emphasis of the Eucharistic revival, which originally, years and years ago, had an emphasis on humanism. One thing that kind of came to mind, though, as it's related to my work, as I said, I'm focused on ecumenical relationships with evangelicals and Pentecostals. These are groups who just don't have a long history of ecumenism from an institutional standpoint. You're always going to have flashpoints of people who are really, really bought into this ministry. But I find it interesting, really in the past decade, there's been new interest in the creation of ecumenical institutions within these groups, such that there's a lot of new opportunities, and a lot that we're catching on to. And just to name a few, for instance, Young Life, if you're familiar with Young Life as a ministry focused on middle school and high school students, about 10 years ago they recognized the need and ways in which their own ministry is a ministry of ecumenism. This is an organization that has roughly 80,000 missionaries worldwide, and they are largely evangelical, and they noticed that they were actually pulling Catholic kids out of the parishes into their churches. I don't think it was anything targeted or anything, just natural, sure, and inviting somebody to Christ. And but they started an ecumenical office. They're doing training on Catholic theology. They've got Catholics employed there, really to empower these Catholic students to go back and to live out the faith in this way. And so now they see themselves as being an ecumenical ministry. This is a huge new ministry now. The Pentecostal charismatic churches in North America who we're holding exploratory dialogues with right now on topics related to the sacraments, which is something that they were interested in. They brought that topic to us. I think it's really interesting. This represents roughly 40 million people within the U.S., within North America, rather. And they've created a commission for Christian unity that represents these different denominations. And so they're starting ecumenical relationships with a number of other people. Most recently, we have a large Baptist group, the North American Baptist Fellowship, that represents roughly 20 million Baptists. They've created an ecumenical officer position, and they're wanting to start ecumenical relationships with us here, with my work at Glen Mary and whatnot. So these are all relatively new in the past 10 years, and it's given a lot of work. There's a lot of work to be done all of a sudden. But they ask different questions, maybe because they're not coming from the history of an ecumenical experience. They're coming from their own experience. And so it's been really wonderful to see and to learn from them their own questions and see how I might grow within that as well. So those are all things that keep me rather busy, but also things that I think are new and exciting within the ecumenical sphere, which I think will shape things in the years to come.
Do you mind repeating the question?
Based on your work, what is important to your faith tradition right now, and what impact do you think it could have on the future?
Thank you. So I just want to make sure I will. So obviously what we do as ecumenical officers, and many of you are in the room, we try to foster the relationship we have, either by being on multilateral organizations such as National Council of Churches, Christian churches together, my case also the World Council of Churches, to which I'm a member of the Central Committee for the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So we try to obviously establish these relationships, but beyond that, I think, especially for the Orthodox Church, it's really about building bridges between this outside world for which Orthodox have no idea, not even interest to know, and the life of the Orthodox Church. So it's not so much about promoting the Orthodox Church, it's actually promoting what is outside of the Orthodox Church and what are the issues, what are the concerns of a society in which Orthodox are part of, but not really involved, or not even asking the questions about what is actually the answer, the response of the church to certain issues. And that comes with the collaboration that we all have, especially when we come here or when we work together on the National Council of Churches, for example, where racial justice issues are obviously not at the center of our community's response. Don't want to say it's not part of the DNA, but we need more awareness, and the work of the office I'm in now is really to bring this awareness to the greater body of the Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in particular. So that's why, for example, we created in 2020 a racial reconciliation webpage as part of our ministry as ecumenical office. This does not come from nowhere. It comes from the relationship we have with one another. It comes from the conversations and the relationship we're building with one another. And this sense of, belonging to this one church and the quest for unity as a one church is really what is motivating our way to be more impactful in the society in which we live. So I would say, in a nutshell, that's what we do.
Roman Catholic theologian Paul Murray introduced the expression receptive ecumenism, the idea that none of us in our own faith traditions know or possess everything that we need to live as a people of faith. Can you help us unpack that expression and the ideas behind it, and then how do they influence your work?
I'm gonna let Nathan start.
So I'm doing a PhD with Paul right now, so that's why he's doing that. So yeah, my doctoral research is on receptive ecumenism, and so the idea is that Paul, being a Catholic theologian, is this idea of there are expressions of the Church of Christ, maybe the language of vestiges of the Church of Christ, and which all of our communions have. And so whereas receptive ecumenism kind of comes into a time in which, for many, ecumenism feels like it's stalled out. It's run into a cul-de-sac. We don't really know where else to go because we kind of come to what's labeled as intractable issues, perhaps. And so Paul takes this idea of these expressions of the Church of Christ, which are uniquely situated within each one of our communions based on the history and the context in which they've expressed themselves. And how do I, as a Catholic, begin to see my areas of need and my areas of desire? So these are the two main things, areas of need and desire. And identify these areas that I need growth in within my own tradition. And then from this place, I begin to look outward. I look out to our ecumenical partners. And I see the ways in which your communion is perhaps expressing a way that answers this need or expresses this desire. And I come to you and I look to learn, and I look to see how I might receive something, as Paul says with the phrase dynamic integrity. Because of my history, because of the way my theology is going to hang with the ways in which these other things are coming, hang in regards to like a coherentist view. It's not just simply we're adding something on top of something else, but we're going to receive it in a way that's going to be uniquely the way that I do it as a Catholic, or my church does it as the Catholic Church. Such that it meets that area of need or desire. Again, these are expressions of the Church of Christ, but then it also becomes an effort in which we are changed. We grow more and more into the likeness of the Church of Christ, and so our churches begin to look different than they did when they began this ecumenical enterprise. And perhaps in this change, which is maybe from various, when Tatis Gratio, we emphasize in this, there can be no ecumenism worthy of the name without a change of heart. And so we move into this ecumenical enterprise as an opportunity for the transformation of our own communions, but in a way that transforms us more into the likeness of who we actually are, not something that's foreign to who we are, which kind of gets on Newman's idea of the development of doctrine. And then we can maybe go back to what is viewed as the intractable issue, but because we have been changed by the experience of the other, we might be able to see that and ask different questions. And so we'll continue with the ecumenical enterprise of unity, but from a different starting place.
So Paul Murray's framework, I can answer it on an individual level, but it's hard for me to answer on the evangelical and Pentecostal community level. And let me tell you why that's the case as part of our discussion. The evangelical world is in part hard to relate to because it's unclear who you're relating to, meaning we don't have even though we have associations, the NAE will say it's 50 million, the Southern Baptists will say 20 million. You'll meet a lot of evangelical and Pentecostal bodies will have huge numbers, more than are probably Americans in America. So what are these bodies is the first question you have to ask. These bodies are associative bodies for which denominational leadership comes to in order to take counsel together. These are actually loose councils of discussion, empowered to do very little beyond to hold the statements of faith. That's what they're empowered to do. They're empowered to hold the statements of faith on behalf of the communities that are present to it. So our community, evangelical and Pentecostals, the main way that we relate and make decisions about who ought to be a pastor is at the congregational level. Questions of intercommunion do not come up as much as questions of theology. What theology do you hold? Is it compatible? And so you will find megachurches with people on staff with varying theology. How could that be, you ask? Well, there's actually a culture norm within evangelicalism that's driven by our publishing houses, our radio channels, and our authors. How do you do ecumenism with a group like that? You do ecumenism with a group like that by trying to speak to the moral imagination. It has to be wide enough ecumenism so that the most number of people can understand that something is occurring. And then from there, you then have to have teaching materials that support that. So when we say evangelical leaders or evangelicals are engaged in these dialogues more, what we're actually saying is denominational heads are more interested in this question than they were 20 years ago. They're more interested, which is why they're allowing their associations to engage. We are still, though, at the stage of what are those encounters in a way that can be made visible. Because the stage after that is what are the teaching materials available at the local level that help people engage this more locally. So for me, Murray's framework of gifts and experience, yes, that I can find a way to answer that as it relates to my own experience of ecumenism on a personal level, the openness to the gifts, looking at a question from a new perspective. But at a kind of mass level, we're still at the stage where the conversation has not yet reached, in our community, a place that says, oh, right, there are other Christian bodies out there besides my own. There's other groups that are out there. Evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, especially the white variations thereof, which there are strong divides in that within evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, is still at the stage where we are fairly insular in our thinking, meaning there's a lot of influence. I was with a group of megachurch pastors on ecumenism and racial justice in Montgomery, and the mindset was, yes, I know I'm in charge of 20,000 people, but I don't want to upset them by saying something controversial. It was literally told to me. And this is a mindset of a poverty of their own influence. It's almost that they see their influence as sinful to acknowledge. And it's important to know as it relates to our community's wounds as you're relating to our community, which is within Murray's framework. But this whole community it's still an open question. But what I would say is the denominational leadership is a lot more open than they were 20, 30 years ago.
Thank you. I will take a different approach to receptive ecumenism, to develop more on the aspect of dialogue itself and ecumenical dialogue as an ethos for dialogue, in the sense that dialogue encapsulates the old mission and vision of this receptive ecumenism, in the sense that we are actually putting the logos, the word, Jesus Christ, as the link that will create the relationship that we need in the exchange of gifts, in which we actually receive the one who is actually connecting us. And this idea was developed in a recent document that was published by the Ecumenical Patriarchate for the Life of the World, the social ethos of the Orthodox Church, in which we have a couple of paragraphs about ecumenical dialogue and the theological dimension to dialogue itself. And it goes back to John 1:1. At the beginning is the word narchi logos, because he's the beginning and the end of our own quest to Christian unity, the rediscovery of our unity in communion, and embracing dialogue as an ecumenical ethos really puts us in such a place where differences, even oppositions, theological debates, find an environment in which we can be fed, we can be nourished by the differences that we receive from the other. So I would say receptive ecumenism is nothing if it's not diving into the very notion of dialogue itself, in which we recognize Jesus' presence. Because dialogue only takes place if Jesus is in the midst of our own relationship. So dialogue is not the negotiation of faith values. Dialogue is not even advertising what we think. But dialogue is really the establishment of this relationship, the communal relationship that we are all longing for as Christians. Thank you.
I really like that. And what I like about that is it's pulling on Paul's idea of this, what we're receiving in the dialogue and who's engaging in the dialogue is this Church of Christ, or the Logos. And one thing that could be easily done within receptive ecumenism is you simply see the thing that you like in somebody else's tradition, and you appropriate it to your own, and it no longer becomes a point of unity. And also, I think from your example, it maybe removes the emphasis of the Logos. And to try to give a kind of a, what does this actually look like? We hosted if you're familiar with the Global Christian Forum, just basically getting people together to share their experience of Jesus. And so we hosted this at Pentecostal Theological Seminary, which is a Church of God Cleveland seminary. We had 3 different Pentecostal denominations there, and then that's in the Diocese of Knoxville, so we had the Catholic representation there, about 50, 60 people. And I had my friend, Father Jim Lawfren, who's Franciscan, come, and he was giving a bit of a talk. I don't think it's a homily particularly, but I was thinking to myself, he's probably the only fully habited Franciscan that's ever spoken on this stage in this Pentecostal chapel. And what he did within that is he's pointing out the cords around him and the knots in it, representing poverty, chastity, and obedience. And he's sharing with all of us how these give him a sense of freedom, how it reminds him of these virtues, and how it reminds him of his own promises. And he went on, and if you guys know, Father Jimmy's brilliant, and so it's a wonderful, wonderful talk. We went back to our groups, so I had about 6 people, half Catholic, half Pentecostal, and there was one very vulnerable Pentecostal pastor who said, you know what, that was really interesting to me, because I grew up thinking that Christ died to overcome the legalism that's represented in wearing a habit or somebody wearing a collar. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that was a thing. But for him it was, And that's how these thoughts get lodged in our minds. He said, but Father Jim said this brings him life and freedom, and I really want that. And now I wish I had something like that habit in my Pentecostal tradition. I don't anticipate seeing a bunch of habited Pentecostals. And if they did, that might not be a reception with dynamic integrity, if you remember. It needs to be something that is true to their tradition, but the impetus is there. He was able to recognize a need or desire, perhaps even poverty within his own tradition, that he wanted to learn from another. And I could say the same thing for my Catholic tradition towards another, as I'm sure we all could on this stage. But I think that provides us some example of what the impetus towards receptive ecumenism is. Now more questions would be raised. How does he receive that? What are other things that he needs to think about within his own tradition? How does that hang with his other theological commitments? But it's kind of entree into working on that question.
How is is your faith family working to train up the next generation of ecumenists in an intentional way?
I think our presence at the workshop, I'm intentionally looking for younger speakers to come and speak, intentionally trying to spend time within the evangelical bodies. There's about 20 that do some degree of unity at the local level to raise this issue of generational transition. I will say that it tends to be millennials and younger who are interested, who are doing the practical work. So maybe the denominational leader who is of boomer generation having some interest, but the person they assign tends to be younger. And so there's an opportunity there. We also have a generational shift in our theologians who are writing about these issues or have interest in these issues. And that's reflected in our dialogues the Kingdom Mission Society helps put together. And so I would say that in both evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, those that are most engaged in these questions tend to be millennial or younger.
It's a great question. I appreciate it. A few months ago, I was contacted completely out of the blue by this group of just young Catholics. I think they were probably in their 20s, and they're really interested in ecumenism. I don't actually think they knew what that word was, but they knew they wanted to be close to other Christians, and they knew they wanted to share the gospel with other people. And somehow they thought that we should talk about this, and so we did. And so we had a number of meetings within the parish, just talking about their own desires. And then one of them came to me and was like, I've really been sitting on this and thinking that I'd really like to do an ecumenical worship service. How do you do that? Do you know any people who'd be interested? And so they hosted with the Baptist church, this time of praise and worship music, intercessory prayer, getting to know one another. They want to do it every other month now in Cincinnati. And so what I think that requires, and I can give a lot of examples, is for me anyway, I need to pay attention because the work of Christian unity is actually already happening. It might not be happening through the channels that I'm typically used to, but I can see that desire in the growing in other people. And I also need to see, how do I encourage them to engage in these within their own way. I mentioned Young Life, for instance. Most of those 80,000 missionaries they have are going to be 20 to 25 years old. There's more and more a sense that Christian unity is an imperative. We don't have the luxury of our divisions anymore. And so I think being able to pay attention to what's actually happening and being willing to come alongside, because those types of events are, they're not just one-off, but I think a groundswell in some ways.
Thank you. Well, I'm not that positive in the sense that we are actually struggling in, training the next generation to ecumenism. Just in our case, in the case of the Orthodox Church, just look at the comments on the Archbishop's webpage or Facebook page or Twitter. Twitter is the worst. And each time he has, when he will meet with USCCB president, when he will go do an ecumenical prayer where Cardinal Dolan will speak at St. Nicholas Shrine, the comments are all about you betraying the church, why are you with heretics, you are selling the church off. So there's a noise out there that is actually influencing many of our younger generation and preventing them to be ecumenically minded. So I would say the first training is by example. When you have pastor, when you have an archbishop, a bishop, every level of the, we have hierarchy. When you have this openness to others, being able to invite your parish priest or pastor next door for Easter or Holy Friday, and be mindful of their presence and existence around you, that's the first step. to teach by example that ecumenism is not a luxury, as we said. Ecumenism is completely part of our mission as Christians. It's not something different from our mission as Christians. That's the first part. The second part is, how do we train the seminarians? Because they're the worst. Because especially our new generation of seminarians, not only they're not interested in ecumenical dialogue or having any kind of relationship with other Christians and Christian denominations, they're even actively against it. Thanks to internet, thanks to a very prominent conservative voice being present on the web and digital means. So they're not interested, and they're even against it. But they're against it because they don't know anything about it. Because they haven't met you. Because they haven't met people from other denominations, churches. They haven't made the step towards recognizing them as their neighbor. And what we're trying to do now in our seminary in Boston is we're creating an ecumenical institute that will be an integral part of the teaching of Holy Cross Orthodox Seminary, in which the teaching will not be only about teaching about the other, teaching about ecumenical dialogue. It will be about inviting the other to come on site and to take the students and to go and meet with the other. So we create this type of openness that they need, and we know they're not going to be all ecumenical minded, and we don't need them all to be like that, but we need at least one or two generation to be in position of leadership so they can mentor by example. And the third aspect, if you don't mind, is mixed marriages. Because this ecumenical training only comes as a shared life together. And where is this shared life of ecumenical struggles, but also blessings takes place? In families. And we need to be pastorally more inclined into finding solutions for these mixed families. Because that way we train their kids to be ecumenically minded, so when they grow up, they are the next generation that will speak on this stage, hopefully. Thank you.
Going to pause here to see if there are any heretics who have questions for the panel.
I'll leave this workshop to go to Miami to address the Reawaken America tour and the expression of Christian nationalism. Will be baptizing people into white Christian nationalism in Miami this weekend. And a lot of people have been drawn to conservative churches now because of Christian nationalism, and ecumenism you're talking about is directly opposite what that's about. And there's one of the things that they'll be, spouting off against is globalism, and nationalism is the answer to globalism. And so how do you see your work resisting this drive to use your faith tradition for these nationalistic purposes?
Thank you, Russell. I mean, on a personal level, I see that quite deeply. in terms of the day-to-day and the week-to-week and month-to-month. On a practical level, that's taken the form of presentations to denominational leaders, and I will, without sharing the substance of who was there, I will give you the reaction so that you have a sense of where the conversation is at the highest denominational level. We had an excellent presentation from one of the, I would say, world-class scholars on Christian nationalism present, and it was a 3-hour presentation with discussion. And most of the denominational leaders at the table, in the sense of just trying to give you a picture, at least for prayer, at least if you want to pray for me and pray for them, that they would be awakened, it was a real sense of, oh, these aren't our people. Oh, we don't know who these people are. The sense of insulation at the highest level is hard to underemphasize. I wish I could say there's something nicer and better, but having done the work, been in the meetings, done the presentations, helped facilitate the person there, there's a real disconnect. And so we've started thinking within my business professional work, how do we communicate at a larger scale what's going on? Because the Reawaken Tour, you're talking about probably a $30 million investment in their activities. And if you listen to their communication, they will say, oh, we can't get the pastors and we can't get the priests to buy into our agenda. What they're actually saying is we can only find a few who will do this for us in the way we would like. But there's a lot of money, there's a lot of money. So there's a communication angle that is big in terms of my personal work, and I wish I had better, more pleasant news at the leadership level. They don't believe it's them doing it, I will put it that way.
Wow. That's a good question. I haven't experienced on the Catholic side, although I know that's certainly there. I haven't direct experience with it. But my first reaction is to think about my engagement with young Catholics and my engagement with a number of denominational leaders within evangelicalism who, at least on the latter, have shared that a number of their church leaders have been, there's a lot of switching between denominations, between traditions, such that a lot of these people are moving from their tradition to what they view as being more historically rooted. So Catholic, Orthodox, Anglicans, but they're citing to me. And I think it's really interesting. And then this kind of growing like nationalism, not globalism. I definitely know what you're citing and have seen that. And I wonder how I would engage that. I think it's important not to react as an activist. It's important to react as pastor. And what's happening to people is they're, I think, experiencing an overwhelming sense of liquid modernity that says that these things about who I am don't matter, or my culture doesn't matter. And so, where there are horrible examples, like what you just cited, and obviously we will say, oh, what are you doing? What are you doing? This isn't us as Christians. There's a much larger movement happening as well that I think sometimes is pulling on the same impetus, but perhaps for a different reason. And we need to pastorally be attentive to the ways in which we can, through like receptive ecumenism, focus on the goods of our tradition. Something that has legs, something that's stable. The Logos, this idea of Christ within our midst. And how does Christ come into that space and offer a kind of foundation within this fragmented way in which our Western society anyway is engaging the world more and more? I feel like that might be more of a pastoral approach. And from there we might be able to say, no, don't let your political identity circumvent your Christian identity, which is what I understand Christian nationalism to be. So that's maybe a few thoughts I have about that.
So take another angle, because the Orthodox Church has had, historically speaking, a very paradoxical relationship to ethnic and national identity, in the sense that 19th century Orthodoxy was about the creation, also the use of the faith in the building of nation states after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So faith becomes an integral dimension of the national identity, even though now with European Union and postmodernity might not be the same, but there is some kind of a reaction or habit that is still very infused into making sure that the national identity is not identical, but still consubstantial somehow. Sorry, that's my... You work with the words you know, right? So, to national identity. Now going to, I want to preface that because it will explain why people are also using conversion to orthodoxy to actually promote what you were describing, the rise of white nationalism, because they find in orthodoxy this relationship, this fusion between national identity and religious identity, based also on the narrative that is fed by, how do you say, sorry, I had the word 5 minutes ago and it escaped me, but anyway, by fake news and by a sense of using religion, especially in the context, now in the global context of the war in Ukraine, where states like Russia are using the very conservative ideology to strengthen their power. But it's not only in Russia, they're also using the same message and narrative here in America, and creating a context or an environment in which people that are deceived by what they see in their home church and home denominations will try to find and somehow shape the Orthodox denomination in which they're going to attend, because they think that it is more masculine, it is more empowering, it is more conservative in terms of the protection of family values, it is more to their taste. The problem is the taste, right? So, and the issue for us as Orthodox is, first of all, to recognize that there is actually now a trend, especially towards even more conservative Orthodox churches, to embrace these new folks that are coming in, that are actually reshaping the understanding of the gospel and its universality, and are actually just perpetuating their sinful attitude towards the other. But they feel safer in a more conservative setting because they think, well, they're a minority church, so we're already a minority, so if we're a minority, we're protected because all minorities are protected. But at the same time, they're perpetuating this narrative of hatred, of parochialism, of bigotry, that does not allow the church to actually fulfill its mission to bring salvation to the world. Conspiracy theory, that's what I want to say. Because it's fascinating. If you look at the way the vocabulary is used and the messaging is used in conspiracy theory, and the way it opposes ecumenism as being a globalism for Christianity. And if you put on the top the cherry of COVID-19 vaccine, you've got the perfect recipe for this type of movements. The issue now is how is the hierarchy reacting to it? And it's been somehow silenced because, well, we're trying to do outreach, we're trying to get more people in our churches. But are they the people we really want, and what should we do to convert them to a more religious Christian message? That's the challenge.
Hi, my name is Reverend Valerie Webster, an Episcopal priest. And Nicholas, I so appreciate how you spoke to the taste of these conservatives who embrace male dominance. And my question to you and any other men in the room who are leaders starts with the observation that Christ had healthy, respectful relationships with women. And from the incels, the involuntarily celibate, to many other of these white Christian nationalist groups, misogyny is right up there with their other attitudes. How might you be greater allies to the women in your traditions and the women outside your traditions?
I mean, as you know, we don't have women priesthood or ordination. However, we have women's leadership in our church. The way we can prepare women to have more leadership role in the church, the COO of the Archdiocese is a woman. The right hand of His Eminence's advisor is a woman. My parish council president is a woman. The vice president is a woman. But being more attentive to not only hear the voice, but leave room for their voices to be a leadership role. That's what we're working on right now. However, you will tell me, so when are the Orthodox are going to have priests or deaconesses?
I would even say just, if you have an ecumenical gathering and there's a woman there, do you make room for her to speak? Or, show respect. I'm not trying to infiltrate another tradition, but when I go to an ecumenical meeting and all the men from the traditions basically want to make sure I don't sit next to them and are very disrespectful, somebody is very disrespectful and not a single other one who knows me says anything, that is hurtful. When are you guys going to step up and have some backbone and treat the women in your midst with respect and not just quietly later on and say, well, I'm sorry. That's the kind of thing I personally experience. Any other women have that?
I was trying to think about this with my wife. My wife is always going to make more money than me. And I was thinking about that because I was talking to a fellow student who's doing his PhD in masculinity and in the workplace. And how for him, his wife's a physician, and he's like, I had to come to this realization, and my wife is always going to make more than me. And for me, it's like, well, yeah, that's interesting, because there is a way in which that is it taps into something that you maybe don't recognize about yourself. Like, what does this mean about how I view myself and my own identity? And I kind of wonder too, maybe I need to spend some more time understanding these nationalist groups, but I do know, like I used to pastor a small evangelical church, it was probably 7 years ago. This guy came to me and he wanted to talk about masculinity, and Mark Driscoll was really big back then, if you guys know who that was. And I just started thinking, what do you want to know? But it was the first time this kind of popped up in my mind. And I think, I'm speculating, but I think there is an overreaction on what you're seeing from that one nationalism side, that it's hyper-masculinity, because of ways in which maybe we don't know how to engage with opening coming from another area. My wife in this particular role that she's in, she works for a tech company that's predominantly run by women. And so as I think about that, I don't know if I have an answer for my tradition. I'm proud of the things certainly that Pope Francis has done. I think Glenmary, I'm proud of what we did in regards to that, of everybody being missionaries. But as I think about the reaction that you're referring to, this hyper-masculinity, I again want to say that, oh, why is that happening? And spend some time on that. Certainly want to be attentive to anybody's, someone like yourself, to be so vulnerable and say, people might not feel comfortable sitting next to you. It's a terrible thing. But
I can tell you most of the female pastors in Montana that I visit with, they simply have stopped showing up because the hostility, why go someplace where you're not wanted? But it would have been really nice if some of those men could have said, I wouldn't want it in my church, but we don't have to be actively hostile here. And this is not just my experience, this is many people's, many women's.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Valerie. There were kind of three parts to your question. One was what's happening within your communities. The second one was how does that relate to what's happening in the society? And the third one, what are you doing about it personally? So I want to take it in three parts as an answer. The first one took me a little while just because I'm 4 and I'm a little tired. But the way this is playing out in evangelical and Pentecostal circles is really around sex scandals. This is where the debates are happening the most. And that may surprise you, may not surprise you, but it's there was, prior to COVID-19, a real strong movement to address pastoral sexual abuse and to remove those pastors from the pastorate. And that stalled after a few high-profile resignations. It stalled, and it got bogged down in legal counsel within those churches that were doing that, meaning the pastor was accused of getting legal counsel, the boards would get legal counsel, but there weren't clear resolutions to that. So that's the way that this conversation is playing out in evangelical and Pentecostal bodies. How it relates to the wider movements in the world, I would say that evangelical and Pentecostal women are not very present in a lot of discussions happening among civic rights, gender rights-based organizations. The way that relates to me is certainly that has been an interest and a passion of mine to see if we could get some funding for those tables in my professional work. That hasn't really overtly materialized, but what I mean by that is there was a lot of discussions, I shouldn't name the names because I don't have the permission, but with senior women on how do we get something that would be woman-focused, funded and supported within evangelical Pentecostal spaces. I think for me, I give myself a half score. On the racial justice and ecumenism side of work, it's 90% woman-led on the evangelical side. On our dialogue work, we have space, but we have work to do. So it's like a reminder to me that this has to be part of the future of ecumenism, which is the title of this dialogue to really focus our efforts wherever our communities may be, that we might have real equity in our process moving forward. So that's a three-part answer.
So as we wrap up, I'm going to invite you each to share one final brief thought that you would like to leave us about where you are finding hope in ecumenical work and where it's leading.
Sure. And I know there's some hands, I know we also have time, but I'll stay afterwards to talk to anyone who'd like. My hope is in the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. My hope is that reconciliation, the cosmic reconciliation that we have, we'll see in the land of the living. I don't know what the future will hold in terms of our society, what will happen in our society, but I think insofar as it depends on me to try to hold space for tables being as wide as possible. That's my hope.
So within my role, when I got started with it, I was given a chance to befriend somebody who's been in ministry, and this ministry a lot longer than I have, these wonderful ecumenical circles. And I just said, what are the ways in you've seen humanism change over the 20 years you've been doing this, youth serving at the Vatican? And he said, we used to lead with the question of structure, and we still need to ask the question of structure. But we're now leading by the question of our experience of Jesus. And this has reframed the way in which we engage ecumenism and has opened up a broader table for more churches to be involved in. And because of that, I think that there's going to be new ecumenical conversations that are happening. I'm already seeing it myself. And also new traditions that haven't typically been part of ecumenism within the majority world, as a matter of fact. I think that'll be really exciting.
Well, my hope is just not to give up on unity, because I think we're exploring so many ways of coming together and exchanging, praying, working together. But sometimes by doing so many things, we also forget the goal of unity. I understand we don't always understand unity as the same reality, but I was struck by a conversation I had at the World Council of Churches where they want to give a theme for the next 8 years. And the theme, the word unity was changed by reconciliation, which is okay. But when you take unity off the equation, that's, in my view, not a great example. So my hope, not to give up on unity.
Amen.